Hello. In this video, I would like to share my thoughts about Unit 2 and look ahead to what you're going to be reading and talking about in Unit 3. So, Unit 2, I enjoyed reading your discussion post. You made a lot of good points. Kind of general ones. You talked about the climate, the idea of multiple histories, the impact of the Europeans, but especially the Spanish in this part of the country, and how they reshaped life in the Americas in many ways, culturally, but also politically and socially. And a number of you mentioned the use of the term myth and how that diminishes the perspectives of the natives and also exposes the biases of the Europeans, very much so. And a number of you also mentioned that the native populations had matriarchal societies, and this is a great contrast with the patriarchal societies of the Europeans, and that is a theme that gets revisited if as well in this part of the country when it becomes part of the United States, also in the rest of Latin America when they become independent. So it is an important theme. We had a couple of readings about Chaco Canyon, and several of you talked about the alignment to the lunar events as well as the solar events. Sorry, and that's important. It's indicative of an advanced society. And we're getting more information with new technology that helps us understand more about the people, but there's still a lot we don't know. Conquest. Conquest was, of course, an important part of this unit. And somebody mentioned a mutual misunderstanding between the Spanish and the Pueblos. There's a historian, James Lockhart, from UCLA, who talks about double mistaken identity, and it's this idea that the people here had been conquered by other people and interactions with other people, and so they thought they knew what they were doing or what to expect. And the same with the Spanish, because of what you read about with the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula and all that stuff. And so they thought, each one of them thought that they knew what to expect, but that didn't happen, and within a generation or two, it was like all bets were off, right? And the role of religion in conquest, and that again dates back to the Reconquista, and the idea of being missionaries for the Catholic faith was very important. Oñate, a number of you talked about how do we decide who to commemorate. And Oñate is really a good example of that conflict. I remember somebody asked, well, what about all the people that died defending their villages? Why don't we have statues to them? And I think that shows a bias, both in European or Euro ethnicity, but also just kind of we honor the important people, right? And of course, whether or not Oñate was important, whether he was good, whether he was worth, commemorating, depends on who you are, right? The Pueblo Revolt. It really exposed the role of the place of the mestizos. It complicates this idea, like somebody said this, complicates the idea of colonizer versus colonized. Certainly it did that. And it foreshadows problems that would come up after the revolt as well, which we'll be reading about in the next unit. And several of you brought up the questions about why the revolt happened and why it took so long to happen. And those are not easy, clear-cut questions, right? Anyway, so I think you have all done a good job with these. That's kind of my thoughts of what were really important. Okay, looking ahead. So Unit 3 talks about the reconquest. We're getting that term again through the Mexican period, and I'll explain what that means. But reconquest, think about what that term means. So we read about the reconquest or Reconquista of Iberia, and then when the Europeans arrived in the Americas, they conquered the area. And after the Pueblo Revolt, their task was to reconquer it. But reconquest kind of implies that it was theirs to begin with, right? Which By then they thought that it was 80 years later. But certainly the Pueblos did not think so. And also it was not bloodless. It brought changes to the relationship between the Spanish and the Pueblos. And so, there follows like a century until Mexico becomes independent from Spain, in which they kind of worked out the terms and that they would come together to forge a society that is in many ways, very important to our society today. The region was becoming more of a part of North America, whether the Spanish wanted that to happen or not. So the power relations between nomadic peoples were shifting, but also power relations between other European colonizers, the French and the British primarily, and they wanted to shore up their claims to North America, as did the Spanish. And so, we start to get some conflicts, and New Mexico and Texas became important buffer regions against the possible encroachment of the English and the French, as well as, other raids by nomadic groups like the Apaches and the Comanches. Things were happening in Europe, and when things happened in Europe, it affected what happened here. And so King Carlos II undertook structural reforms that brought about changes in all of the Spanish Empire, but also very significantly to New Mexico. And part of that dates back to what I said before about being a buffer region. So the Spanish Empire, which was the largest empire at the time, was in a state of decline. It was so big, it was difficult for them to maintain. The Spanish kings were in many, many wars, which are very, very expensive, even though they were getting regular ships back from the silver mines in both from Peru, Potosi, and also in northern Mexico, in the area of Zacatecas. So they're getting all this silver back, and yet they're spending it all. And of course, those ships were being attacked by pirates, so that diminished them. And there was an old system of the Habsburg Empire and overlapping, jurisdictions in Europe, but also overlapping jurisdictions in the Americas between the church and the viceroy. Okay. And so the changes were called the Bourbon Reforms. And why? Because Carlos died without an heir. So there was a battle again at the end of the 1700s, I think. 1600s. Anyway, there was a war, and you'll read about it. And the Bourbon family from France, because all these, the royal families had intermarried so much that many people made claims to this throne, right? But the Bourbon family ruled a lot differently than the Habsburg family did. So they made a lot of reforms, but the ones that were important here were they established a new category called the Provincias Internas, or internal provinces. They built a line of presidios, or forts, along the 30th parallel. They reorganized the northern section of Spain, and they so these presidios or forts were spaced out, and then they created a contingent of light troops and of flying companies or cavalry troops units, and they were designed to protect the gaps in between them. They saw increased raids, especially by the Comanches, though they did begin peace negotiations, and eventually they made peace negotiations with everybody except the Apaches. And they started giving Apaches supplies to make them dependent but peaceful. That's important. That comes up again later, right? The Bourbon reforms had an impact in Latin America, and they were impacted by a lot of other things that you've probably read about or talked about in other history classes. So the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and those contributed to the wars for independence in Mexico and South America. And you'll read about the events in Mexico and how it impacted, think about how it impacted New Mexico. In some ways, very little, and in other ways, a lot. There were people who helped the Nuevo Mexicanos identify with Mexico. Other people wanted nothing to do with it. They wanted Spain back, etc. And we start to see more outsiders coming in. One of the things that Mexico did was open up trade, and that with other people, because Spain was very restrictive about who their colonies could trade with. So Mexico says, sure, trade with the rest of North America. And so the Santa Fe Trail, Santa Fe Trade Network started, and it became very important. Mexico continued a practice that Spain had started of colonizing Texas, because New Mexico had most of the people, and they wanted more people in Texas so that it could be part of that buffer region, right? And so they offered land grants, basically grants of land to what they called impresarios, and most of those were people like Stephen Austin, and he gave land grants to Southerners who were looking for more land to plant cotton, because cotton was a very important crop then. And they brought in their slaves with them. Well, that was important in part because Mexico freed slaves with independence. And one of the things that those people coming in, those colonizers, wanted was to bring their slaves. And so, but they were supposed to follow the laws of Mexico. So that brought a strife in the region that will come back to haunt them all later. But we also see some internal strife in New Mexico, an example being the Chimayo Rebellion, which was a spontaneous class uprising, and what they wanted was to be able to control themselves, to rule themselves. They didn't like the fact that they were a territory of Mexico and not a state like the rest of Mexico was. Okay, so that's what you're going to be reading about. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks.